No one noticed her at first. Barefoot. Shivering. Just 4 years old, standing in the middle of a noisy street. Peel walked past her like she didn't exist. Then she began to sing, "Goodness of God." Her tiny voice trembled, cracked, and suddenly changed. The crowd froze. Conversations stopped. Some felt chills. Others wiped tears. In that moment, everyone realized this wasn't just a song. It was hope coming from the most unexpected place. No one noticed her at first. That's how it usually was. The street was alive with noise cars honking, footsteps echoing against concrete, voices overlapping in hurried conversations. People moved quickly, eyes fixed on phones, coffee cups in hand, minds already somewhere else. In the middle of all that motion stood a little girl who looked like she had stepped out of another world entirely. She was only 4 years old. Her shoes were missing. Her small feet resting on cold pavement that stung with every shift of her. Wait, the sleeves of her jacket were too short, frayed at the edges, as if they had belonged to someone else long before they belonged to her. A gentle breeze passed through the street, and she hugged herself tightly, not from fear, but from the quiet habit of staying warm. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply stood there. Beside her was a microphone that looked far too big for her tiny hands. The stand wobbled slightly whenever a truck passed by, and she steadied it with care, as if it were something precious. Her fingers were small and careful, holding on like she understood that this moment mattered even if she didn't yet know why. People walked past her without slowing down. A man in a suit brushed by, talking loudly into his phone. A woman glanced for half a second, then looked away, her face tight with worry about things only adults carry. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, curious, but was quickly pulled along. No one meant to be unkind. They were just busy. Life had taught them to keep moving. The little girl watched them go. Her eyes were wide, not with sadness, but with quiet patience. She had learned early that the world doesn't always stop for small voices. Still, she waited. Not for attention, not for pity, just for the right moment. She took a breath, small at first, then deeper. The kind of breath someone takes before doing something brave. Her chest rose and fell as she stood there, steadying herself against the noise, against the cold, against the feeling of being unseen. Somewhere inside her, there was a calm that didn't match her age. A calm born not from ease, but from endurance. She looked up, not at the crowd, but just above them. And in that instant, before a single note was sung, before anyone realized what was about to happen, something shifted. Because even though no one was listening yet, her heart was already singing. The first note barely rose above the noise. It slipped out softly, almost unsure of itself, like it was asking permission to exist. A few people nearby didn't even realize singing had begun. The street was still loud, impatient, alive with everything except attention. The little girl tightened her grip on the microphone. Her voice wavered, not because she was afraid, but because it carried weight far heavier than her small frame. Each word came from a place deeper than memory, deeper than understanding. She didn't know the meaning of every lyric, but she felt them. They felt like warmth, like safety, like something she could hold on to when the world felt too big. She sang the way she lived, quietly, carefully, without expecting applause. Her voice cracked on the second line. A fragile break that might have made an adult stop. She swallowed, took a breath, and continued anyway. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was honest. A woman slowed her steps. Then another person paused. Just for a second. Something about the child's voice didn't match the scene. It didn't belong to the rush or the noise. It sounded like it came from somewhere softer. Somewhere people had forgotten how to reach. The girl shifted her feet against the cold ground, grounding herself. Her shoulders relaxed slightly as the melody wrapped around her. Singing had always done that. It made the ache quieter. It made the waiting easier. As she reached the chorus, something unexpected happened. Her voice began to change. The trembling softened, the cracks faded. The sound grew steadier, fuller, still small, but suddenly strong. It wasn't louder, but it carried farther, like it had learned how to travel. The note held longer than anyone expected from someone so young. Heads began to turn. The street didn't get quieter, but it felt quieter. Conversations slowed. Footsteps hesitated. People who had passed moments before found themselves stopping, turning back, trying to understand what they were hearing. The little girl didn't notice. Her eyes were closed now, her face calm. There was no audience in her world, only the song. And the feeling it gave her. With every word, her voice grew more confident. As if something inside her had finally been given permission to speak. This wasn't the voice of a child seeking attention, it was the voice of a child who had learned how to survive by holding on to hope. A man near the back of the forming crowd felt his throat tighten. He didn't know why. A woman pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes suddenly wet. Someone whispered, "She's so little." But the little girl just kept singing. And in that moment, everyone who listened felt it, the quiet realization that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it sings softly until the world finally listens. The crowd didn't form all at once. It happened slowly, one person stopping. Then another, as if drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. People who had been rushing moments before now stood still, unsure why their feet refused to move forward. The noise of the street faded into the background, replaced by something quieter, heavier, more meaningful. They were listening. Near the front stood a street musician, violin resting against his side. He had played on corners like this for years. Through heat and rain, applause and indifference. He thought he had heard every kind of sound a street could offer. Yet as the little girl sang, his hands loosened their grip. His music could wait. This moment could not. Her voice wasn't powerful in the way people expected power to be. It didn't demand attention. It invited it. Each note felt fragile, yet unbreakable, like a candle flame, refusing to go out in the wind. People began to see her clearly now. Not just the bare feet. Not just the worn clothes. They saw the courage it took to stand there. They saw the calm on her face, the way her shoulders lifted and fell with each breath. They saw a child who had learned how to carry herself in a world that rarely slowed down for her. And something shifted inside them. A man in a business jacket lowered his phone and stared. Suddenly embarrassed by the meeting he had been late for so many times before. A woman clutched her purse tighter, remembering a lullaby she used to sing to her own daughter. A teenager wiped his eyes quickly, hoping no one would notice. They didn't know her story, but they felt it. It was in the way her voice held steady. In the way she sang, without fear of being ignored. In the way she trusted the song to carry her, even if no one else would. Someone whispered, "She's only 4." And the words passed through the crowd like a wave. Heads shook softly in disbelief. How could someone so small carry something so heavy and something so beautiful at the same time? For the first time that day, strangers looked at one another. Not with impatience or distraction, but with shared emotion. In her voice, they recognized pieces of themselves. Longing, faith, hope they thought they had misplaced, This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a reminder. A reminder that life isn't measured by comfort, but by courage. That's strength. It doesn't always come from having more, but from holding on when there's very little. That sometimes the most important lessons come from voices we almost didn't hear. The girl opened her eyes briefly and looked out at the crowd. She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply kept singing, steady, present, unafraid. And in that moment, everyone understood. They weren't just listening to a song. They were witnessing a quiet miracle, one that asked nothing from them except to feel, to remember, and to care. The final note lingered in the air long after her voice grew quiet. For a brief moment, no one moved. The street, once restless and impatient, stood perfectly still, as if everyone was waiting for permission to breathe again. The little girl lowered the microphone slightly, unsure what came next. She didn't look up. She never expected anything to follow the song. Then someone stepped forward. It was a woman near the front of the crowd. She knelt slowly, careful not to frighten the child, and slipped her coat from her shoulders. Without a word, she wrapped it gently around the girl's small frame. The coat was too big, but it was warm. The girl looked down at it, then up at the woman, confused but calm. That was all it took. Another person reached into a pocket. Then another. Coins landed softly at first, then bills. But it wasn't the sound of money that changed the moment. It was the way people's faces softened as they gave, not out of pity, but out of connection. A man crouched down and adjusted the microphone so it stood steady. "You did great," he said quietly, his voice breaking. The girl nodded, clutching the coat tighter around herself. Someone offered her a pair of shoes. Someone else handed her a warm drink. A street musician lifted his violin and began to play, not to perform, but to support, gentle notes wrapping around her like a promise. Strangers who had never spoken before exchanged looks, small smiles, shared tears. For the first time, the girl felt something new, not fear, not hunger. Not cold, but belonging. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't known how. Yet kindness found her anyway. It moved through the crowd like a quiet agreement. We won't walk past this moment. Parents pulled their children closer. Some whispered lessons they hadn't planned to teach that day. Others simply stood in silence, letting their hearts read something simple and essential. The little girl looked up again, this time scanning the faces around her. They were different now, softer, kinder, present. Her lips trembled not from cold, but from the sudden weight of being seen. She smiled. It was small, hesitant, but real. And in that smile, the crowd felt it, the truth they often forgot in busy lives and crowded streets, that one act of kindness can ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the moment it's given. That day, generosity didn't come from wealth or status. It came from people choosing to stop, to notice, to care, and standing there, wrapped in warmth and surrounded by strangers who felt like family. The little girl learned something, too, something she would carry long after the street emptied. That even in a hard world, goodness still shows up. As the crowd slowly began to drift away, the street didn't return to how it had been before. Something invisible lingered in the air, something softer than sound, stronger than noise. The little girl stood wrapped in the oversized coat, her small hands tucked into its sleeves, watching people leave with slower steps and quieter hearts. She didn't fully understand what had happened. She only knew that she wasn't cold anymore. A volunteer from a nearby shelter approached gently, kneeling to meet her eyes. The girl listened as kind words were spoken, words about safety, warmth, and tomorrow. She nodded, trusting in a way only children still can. Nearby, the musician played a final, tender melody, one that felt less like a performance and more like a goodbye. As she was guided away from the street, people turned back for one last look. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They carried the moment with them, instead folded quietly into their hearts. That night, the little girl slept in a warm bed. It wasn't a grand ending. There were no flashing lights or sudden miracles. But there was comfort. There was care. There was the beginning of something better. Days later, videos of that moment began to spread. Millions heard her voice through screens and speakers, feeling the same ache in their chests they had felt on that street. Comments poured in from all over the world, people sharing tears, prayers, and promises to be kinder, slower, more present. But the most powerful change wasn't online, it was in the people who had stood there that day. The man who lowered his phone called his family that night and stayed on the line longer than usual. The woman who gave her coat began volunteering on weekends. Parents listened more closely to their children. Strangers smiled at one another just a little more often. Because a small girl sang when no one was listening. Her voice didn't just change in that moment, it changed others. It reminded people that goodness isn't something you wait for. It's something you choose. Sometimes it shows up quietly, wrapped in a fragile melody. Carried by a child who has every reason to give up but doesn't. Single quotes, and somewhere. Whenever the little girl sings again, whether to herself, to a room, or to the world, there is a strength in her voice that wasn't there before. Because she learned something too. That even when you feel small, even when you feel unseen, your voice still matters. And sometimes, the simplest song can become a light one that keeps singing long after the sound fades.